France is in trouble. In just a few months, the government collapsed, borrowing costs surged, and for the first time in history, the national debt rose above $4 trillion, meaning more than the entire economy produces in a single year. At first glance, this might sound like just another European debt story. After all, some other European countries are even more indebted. But France is different. This is not just any country. It is the second largest economy in Europe and accounts for nearly 1/5 of the entire euro area. And if it were ever unable to repay its debts, the shock would not stop at its borders. It would spread across the whole continent. Warning signs are already there. It has been more than half a century since France last finished a year with a budget surplus. For 51 years in a row, it has spent more than it earned, and every government has simply borrowed to plug the gap. This way of running a country cannot last forever. Yet every time France tries to fix the situation, chaos follows. Since the 1970s, pensions have grown faster than the wages of younger workers, and for the first time in history, retirees now receive, on average, more in pensions than working people earn in salaries. Still, real reform keeps failing. Politics is stuck. One party wants higher taxes, another wants spending cuts, a third wants reforms, but no solution lasts more than a few years. The same scenario repeats again and again. A government is elected, it proposes changes, resistance rises, the government falls, and the cycle starts all over. Meanwhile, French debt is growing by roughly 5,000 euros every single second, and people are beginning to ask what will happen if nothing changes. If France fails to bring its finances under control, the rest of Europe may be forced to step in, whether it wants to or not. And if that happens, the entire euro area could be at risk. For most of the last century, France was a symbol of prosperity. It built one of the most generous social systems in the world. If you got sick, the state paid for your treatment. If you lost your job, unemployment benefits kept you afloat. And when you retired, a pension was waiting. From the moment a child was born, it was clear that education from kindergarten to university would be free. This became part of the French identity, a promise that the state would always protect its citizens. For decades, it seemed to work. The economy grew, living standards were high, and France secured its position as the second strongest economy in Europe, right after Germany. The French model was admired at home and abroad as proof that a modern economy could combine capitalism with a strong social safety net. But there was a catch. It was extremely expensive, and even with high taxes, the gap had to be financed by debt every single year without exception since 1974. For more than half a century, budget deficits were the rule, not the exception. At first, this did not look like a problem, because debt is not necessarily a bad thing. If it supports growth, especially long-term growth, it can even help an economy, and France worked this way for decades. The economy was strong, the workforce was young, and millions of people were paying into the system, so generous benefits seemed sustainable. Over time, however, these benefits became more than just policy. They became part of national identity. People came to expect the state to step in at every stage of life, to pay for healthcare, guarantee a pension, and provide months of unemployment support. It was not just help, it was a promise. But that promise became harder and harder to keep. In the 1990s, there were 5 workers for every 1 retiree. 2 decades later, there were only 3. Pensions and healthcare began to consume a growing share of the budget, while the number of people paying for them through taxes was shrinking. Under normal circumstances, this would have set off alarm bells. But France was protected by a lucky combination of factors. The introduction of the euro pushed interest rates to historic lows. Instead of reform, politicians leaned on debt. Why risk protests when you can borrow cheaply? On the surface, the system looked stable. Underneath, it was far more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. Then came the turning point. In the year 2008, the global financial crisis hit. France, like others, had to spend billions to rescue the economy. People lost their jobs, and families that had once contributed to the system suddenly depended on it. Tax revenues fell, welfare spending soared. In just 2 years, debt jumped from roughly 60 to 80% of gross domestic product. It was the first real warning that the whole model was far more vulnerable than it appeared. This should have been the moment for fundamental change. While countries like Greece and Spain were forced into painful rescue programs, France stayed largely out of the spotlight and avoided the harshest pressure. There was no sense of urgency. Instead of tightening its belt, the country relied on the European Central Bank and its decision to cut interest rates. Borrowing became cheap again, and France went even deeper into debt. But it was no longer the same country as before. The population was aging, the workforce was shrinking, and public spending kept rising. The pattern repeated. Ultra-low interest rates masked the real problems. Politicians, it felt like easy money and a comfortable way to postpone unpopular decisions. As long as debt was cheap, reforms could wait. More was borrowed, more was promised, and year after year the system became more fragile. It was a gamble that worked, until it did not. Then the pandemic arrived. When the economy shut down, France had to intervene on a massive scale once again. Support programs, rescue packages, and state-guaranteed loans were launched. Hundreds of billions were poured into job protection schemes, corporate bailouts, and emergency healthcare. When things finally stabilized, debt had climbed above 110% of gross domestic product. For the first time since the Second World War, the country owed more than it produced in a year. At that moment, the illusion finally vanished. A French debt crisis was no longer a theoretical threat. It had become reality. The truth is that the French welfare state had long been too expensive to function without constant borrowing. Decades of deficits were built into the system itself. The pandemic simply pushed it over the edge. The period of calm ended, and what remains is a spiral in which France now finds itself fully trapped. The problem today is not just the sheer size of the debt. It is that the country is stuck in a loop with no clear way out. The social model was built in a different era, a time of cheap loans and fast economic growth. That world no longer exists. Interest rates are rising. The economy is slowing, and suddenly financing healthcare, pensions, and social benefits is far harder than before. This is where France truly stands out. No other advanced country spends as much on the public sector. Out of every euro the economy produces, about 57 cents go to government spending. Last year alone, France ran a deficit of roughly 167 billion euros. More than 50 billion of that did not go to schools, hospitals, or new infrastructure, but simply to interest payments, the cost of servicing debt created by past promises. Altogether, the state spends about 6% more than the entire economy produces. For comparison, the limit set by the European Union is 3%, and France is almost double that. It has not met this target once since the pandemic, and current forecasts suggest this will not change anytime soon. The reason the deficit keeps growing is simple. Most spending is tied to permanent commitments that cannot just be cut or paused without triggering a major social crisis. And this brings us to the most sensitive issue of all, the one item that is draining the system more than anything else: pensions. France now spends more on pensions than almost any other country in the world. Last year, these costs exceeded 350 billion euros, about 14% of the entire economy, far above the European average of around 10%. To put it in perspective, pensions now cost the French state more than education, defense, and transport combined. The real problem, however, is not only their size, but how quickly the balance between workers and retirees has shifted. When the system was created, seniors made up less than 15% of the population. The balance worked. Today, the share of retirees has risen to around 22%, and by the year 2050, it is expected to approach 30%. Nearly 1 in 3 people will be retired. And it is not just that there are more retirees, people also live much longer. The average French person now lives almost 11 years longer than 50 years ago. That means a full decade more of pension payments, higher healthcare costs, and greater social support, something the system was never designed for. In simple terms, the French pension system works on a pay-as-you-go basis, where the money coming in today is immediately used to pay today's pensions. But there are fewer workers, and their contributions no longer cover the growing burden. On top of that, there is another problem. Those who do work are not producing as much value as before. Labor productivity, once among the strongest in Europe, has fallen sharply in recent years. Part of this is due to the structure of the labor market. More and more young people stay longer in education, earn advanced degrees to stand out, but suitable jobs often do not exist. Nearly 1 in 4 graduates ends up in a position that does not require their level of education. Years of study, but only a limited contribution to overall economic output. Instead of each worker creating more wealth and stabilizing the system, output per employee is declining. The result is a double pressure. There are fewer taxpayers, and each of them contributes less than before. Now comes the crucial catch. Everyone in France knows this cannot continue. Economists warn about it, investors see it, and even the government admits it. Yet every time someone tries to change the system, the country explodes. In the year 2023, more than 3 million people took to the streets in a single day to protest President Macron's pension reform. From an international perspective, it was a relatively mild change, raising the retirement age from 62 to 64. For comparison, in Germany and Italy, it is already 67, and in the United States, it is around 66. In France, however, the reaction was explosive. Strikes paralyzed transport, garbage piled up in Paris, and demonstrations lasted for weeks. Polls showed that nearly 70% of the population opposed the reform, even though economists almost unanimously agreed it was necessary. When Parliament also blocked it, President Macron pushed it through using a constitutional loophole. Instead of calming the situation, this only deepened the anger. His popularity collapsed, and the government narrowly survived a no-confidence vote. The reform passed on paper, but politically, it came at a huge huge cost. Macron's party lost its majority in parliament, and the government became too weak to push through major changes. Every new proposal now sinks into endless negotiations and stalls before it can move forward. And this is not just about Macron. Every time a president has tried to reform pensions, the result has been the same: protests, strikes, and changes that were either weakened or abandoned. This is the trap of the French system. Reform is urgently needed. Every attempt is blocked by politics or the streets. Since the year 2022, France has already had 5 prime ministers, and no reform has lasted. For ordinary people, it feels like an endless loop. One government promises change, the next reverses it. Strikes continue, pensions remain uncertain, and the cost of living keeps rising. Investors are watching closely. They see rising debt, an aging population, and a divided country unable to act. Trust is slowly fading. For decades, France was viewed as one of the safest borrowers in Europe, a giant economy second only to Germany. But when doubts grow, money is no longer cheap. Interest rates rise, and investors demand a higher reward for risk. France has entered this tightening circle. Warnings now come not only from economists, but from rating agencies. They have already lowered France to its weakest rating in modern history. For the first time, it now costs France roughly the same to borrow as Italy. Even more troubling, today's numbers resemble Greece before its crisis. In the year 2010, Greek 10-year bond yields were around 3.3%. France is now close to that level. Back then, a small loss of confidence was enough for borrowing costs to spiral and for Greece to be cut off from markets. France is now flirting with the same danger. As long as investors believe, the system holds. Once they do not, the spiral could accelerate rapidly, and this would affect all of Europe. France makes up roughly 1/5 of the euro area. If the second largest economy began to wobble, it would shake confidence in the entire project. With debt above 3 trillion euros, any rescue would be extraordinarily difficult. The euro was built on rules of discipline, deficits below 3%, and debt below 60% of economic output. France has long been far beyond these limits, and that weakens trust in the whole system. At the core lies one hard fact: France is too big to fail. If borrowing costs surged, the European Central Bank would likely have to intervene and buy French bonds to stop panic. But that would set a dangerous precedent. Once one country is saved, others would demand the same, and fiscal discipline would give way to reliance on the central bank. Europe has so far avoided crossing that line. There is no proven solution. Smaller countries like Greece, Portugal, or Ireland could be rescued, but France is almost 10 times larger than Greece. A crisis would force an impossible choice: either intervene and risk political backlash in countries like Germany or the Netherlands, or do nothing and let one of the pillars of the monetary union collapse. Both options would endanger the euro itself. And there is a wider context. The United States faces similar debt pressures. Its national debt has passed $37 trillion, more than $110,000 per person. Interest payments already absorb about 6% of economic output, more than defense spending. Such vulnerabilities are closely watched, especially by China, which once held over $1.3 trillion in United States government bonds and now holds about $780 billion. In this environment, questions of stability and economic sovereignty are moving back to the center of global politics. That is why France matters. It is not just about one country's budget. It is about whether advanced economies can sustain social models built in times of growth and cheap money, in a world of aging populations, expensive borrowing, and rising uncertainty. How France responds may offer a glimpse of the future for all of Europe, and perhaps for the entire Western world.